Okay, great. Okay, so the topic tonight is post-traumatic stress disorder. And as everyone on this call already knows, my name is Heidi. I am the Resource Family Coordinator at JFS. And I've been working at JFS for about a year and working in this field for about 5 years. And here's some of the things that we are going to talk about today. Before I look through this agenda, I just want to give a couple of disclaimers. It's not my intention that any information that we're talking about tonight is triggering to you, but I think it's really challenging to predict what might trigger a person or might be difficult for you as a person to listen to or work through. So you have absolute permission to walk away or step away if you feel like it's overwhelming, or it's just not, mentally you're not in a headspace to hear that information. Obviously, you have a choice to walk away if you need to parent your child or anything like that as well, because this is a really low key and friendly session. Okay, so I want to talk about what PTSD is, give some definitions, both kind of formal and informal, talk about the differences between trauma itself and then post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, talk about some brain basics, how the brain works and how trauma impacts the brain, review symptoms of PTSD and behaviors you might see, discuss how that connects and might intersect with other mental health or other common diagnoses we see for kids in care. And then I don't have them in the PowerPoint, but I can email after this training a list of resources if you want to kind of learn more. So would someone be willing to read this for me, this definition of PTSD from the APA? Do I have a volunteer?
I can do it for you, Heidi.
Thanks.
According to the American Psychiatric Association, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is a psychiatric disorder that may occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, series of events, or set of circumstances. An individual may experience this as emotionally or physically harmful or life-threatening and may affect mental, physical, social, and or spiritual well-being. Examples include natural disasters, serious accidents, terroristic acts, war, combat, rape, sexual assault, historical trauma, or intimate partner violence and bullying.
Thanks. So, like, as a group for just a moment, I just want to pause and talk about what it says here may occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event. So what makes an event traumatic for a person? What does that mean? What does that look like?
It can be anything. It can be anything because what is traumatic to one person isn't traumatic to another person. In our situation, dealing with kids, in the foster care system, just the point of being separated from the parents can be traumatic enough to set this off. But it can be as drastic as like it said, sexual rape, seeing a parent being assaulted, all of that can cause PTSD. It doesn't have to be traumatic to one person as what is traumatic to a second person.
Mhm.
So I think that gives you a wide window of what PTSD can cover.
Mhm.
So a lot of people say that kids that are in the hospital for a long time can get PTSD. A lot of parents with special needs kids can be diagnosed with PTSD because you're constantly on alert. You're constantly worrying about, doing kids.
Mhm.
Um, Family members who are also dealing with family that has kids with these kind of events can have the PTSD. So, or the parents themselves having their children removed from them can have the same issues.
Mhm.
So, I guess the biggest thing is that it's a big window and you
Mhm.
can't really categorize any one thing.
Yeah, wow, you're like way ahead of me on my slides. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything that they want to weigh in on that question? What does it mean for someone to have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event?
Am I allowed to talk?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, I think Jean hit the nail on the head that it's very personal because two people could experience the exact same thing and one person doesn't have any trauma. So they talk about little t and big T, but really it's very personal. Little t trauma, big T trauma, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing in my work, all the kids that I work with, they all have a PTSD diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So, moving on to the actual, oh gosh, my computer didn't freeze. Here we go. So a diagnosis of PTSD requires exposure to an upsetting traumatic event. Exposure includes directly experiencing an event, witnessing a traumatic event happen to others, or learning that a traumatic event happened to a close family member or friend. It can also occur as a result of repeated exposure to horrible details of trauma, such as police officers exposed to details of child abuse cases. So, to Jean's point that she just made, and to Kim's point, this definition is extremely broad. Exposure includes directly experiencing things, indirectly, things like that. So, can we as a group, for everyone who's on, tell me at least one thing? And Jean already mentioned removal from birth parents. So we have that as a given. What are some other things that the kids in our care go through or might go through that would fit under this definition, just in broad strokes?
Witnessing a parent overdose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say death of a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Witnessing domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And Stacy Miller said abuse.
Thank you. Yeah, and I, just even like reading the news today, I'm thinking about this one, learning that a traumatic event happened to a close family member or friend. As we even think about, like, for example, what happened here, September 11th, or looking at events around the world, knowing that our family members or people that we love and care about are kind of in harm's way. All of that is exposure to a traumatic event that impacts each person individually. Great. So,
Wait, one more, separated from siblings.
yes. Mm-hmm. What a huge loss. So Kim kind of already mentioned this a little bit, but perception of the event in terms of trauma and PTSD is really important. So an event is traumatizing when it is experienced as a trauma by an individual. There are events that might traumatize one person and not another, even though the event was experienced by both. So I want to focus on that statement. An event is traumatizing when it is experienced as a trauma by an individual. So this is completely subjective and about how your brain and your individual body reacts to a certain event that you have experienced. So you could go through something that I think is like horrifically traumatic, and for you, you're like, oh, okay, like it was what it was, it's okay. Or you could go through something that I might not struggle with, and for you, it was really impactful in your life. So there's this perception of the event, and like Kim mentioned, the degree of trauma, that little t, like minor trauma, or that big T, paralyzing, really deeply wounding trauma. So as we have this conversation today, it's important to remember that trauma is experienced on a continuum. So sometimes a potentially traumatic event might evoke something else. It might evoke grief, or loss, or grief reaction in a person. Sometimes it does traumatize somebody, but the individual is able to recover, and that doesn't leave any emotional or brain related scars. So Robin Jones says, not every drama is a trauma. But knowing that trauma is experienced on a continuum, and knowing that that experience is individual for each person, as we reflect on the kids that we're caring for, we need to have that lens be really wide for them. And because everyone experiences things differently, you might even see a significant difference in terms of how siblings experience an event. So I know for me, as an example from my life, I grew up attending a boarding school. When I was 6 years old, my parents dropped me off in a different country. And this was back in the, before the days of cell phones and FaceTime and things like that, and said, we'll see you in 3 months. And I was fine with that. And then they dropped my brother off at boarding school. And from day one, it just was not a right fit for him. And it was really challenging. Similarly, my family, my husband and I have adopted 2 sets of siblings, but my younger set of siblings both lived with the same birth parents. And one seems to be like really resilient and not really have any ongoing significant mental health or other issues. And my other son, his brother, who was actually there a shorter amount of time, has really significant mental health and other challenges. So I say that to share, as you reflect upon your own life, don't minimize events that were traumatic to you. If they're still impacting your life, and that is real, and there's no shame in acknowledging that your brain responded in a certain way to a certain event. So let's talk a little bit about trauma versus PTSD. So the illustration I like to use is that trauma is the wound, the event that happened or the hurt that you or this child experienced. And PTSD is when that wound becomes infected. So we know, like in the hospital, if you ever have to go to the hospital and you're wounded, they have a trauma bay and they're healing physical wounds on your body. And a lot of times they can stitch those up, and then we have maybe scars to show or evidence of a surgery that we had, but there's no real lasting ongoing impact to our functioning. But sometimes those wounds get infected and they're really not healthy. They're really painful and they're an ongoing irritation in our everyday lives. So that's kind of how I think of the difference between having these traumatic individual or ongoing chronic events and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where that trauma wound really becomes infected. So I want to spend a lot of time tonight talking about how trauma impacts the brain. Because I think understanding and supporting a person with PTSD starts with understanding how their brain works and how their brain is responding to that trauma that they've experienced. And part of the reason I think it's so important to focus on the brain is because a lot of times when people are diagnosed with or have symptoms of PTSD and a lot of these other conditions that we're discussing in this series, they are what I would call invisible disabilities. So these wounds are there, the infection of the wound is there, but walking down the street, you can't tell that a person has PTSD, and it can be really challenging to understand what's going on with them. When outwardly, they might physically appear typical or healthy. So looking at the brain and trying to understand and gain insight into what's going on in their brain, I think is really important. So to do that, we're going to look at Bruce Perry's brain states paradigm. And this is taught by Lakeside Global, which is the organization that I got my trauma certification through. So they say a person is in a specific brain state because of the perception of how safe the environment or particular situation appears to be. The brain, using memories and past experiences, makes a split-second decision as to which part of the brain needs to dominate in order to best maintain safety. So there's so many things there in that quote. A person's in a specific brain state, not because of how safe they actually are, but because of their perception of how safe the environment is. And their brain, within a split second, is making decisions for them about how they should behave based on that level of perceived safety. So there's a second definition here. My thing will click forward. Nope, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So the 5 brain states are, in any given moment, a person is in one of these 5 brain states. So all of us on this Zoom are in one of these states as well. You're calm, or you're a little bit alert, aroused a little bit. You are alarmed, fearful, or terrorized. So it's going down into the brainstem, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is the kind of anecdotal definition that I like for PTSD. So it's important to note that a child or adult may in fact be in a safe environment, and yet the brain has responded as if it is in a dangerous environment. This reaction can be triggered by past experiences and conscious or unconscious memories. that have influenced the brain's decision about which brain state needs to be activated. So to me, like, this is like the reality of what PTSD looks like. And as parents, it can be really challenging, especially when a child's been in a safe environment with you, sometimes for quite some time, and they still seem to be behaving or acting in a way that makes it appear that they don't feel safe in that environment. And that is all about their brain chemistry and the messages that their brain is giving them. So I think it's important to remember that as parents, because then we don't take that personally. If we can understand that perspective, we understand the why behind that and how our child's brain is working, and don't view that as like something that they're not supported by us, they're not connected to us. It's more just what their brain has been trained to do, which is to keep them safe and keep them alive. Okay, so the brain states, oh, the body keeps score. So I added this to Kim's recommendation. So it is important to note, I think, that what I'm talking about tonight does have a lot to do with the brain, but trauma also lives in the body. So we're going to be talking about the mind and the brain, but if you want to dive a little deeper into how trauma impacts the body, this is a great resource to look at. Okay, so these brain states connect to the actual areas of your brain, and each of those areas has specific functioning. So when you are calm, you're accessing your cortex, which is your highest level of functioning. That's what you need for executive functioning, to think through problems, to multitask, to be creative. Your highest level of thinking and future planning is all located in your cortex. And then as you go down through your limbic system, your midbrain, and your brainstem, those are more primitive parts of your brain that are responsible for things like monitoring your body temperature and your heartbeat and blood flow through your heart into your brain and things like that. So there's a connection, and we'll go through some of these slides and see the relationship here between each of these things. So again, calm and alert, you're accessing the most highly functional part of your brain. When you're sent or you're experiencing these other stages of brain, you're alarmed about something, you're a little nervous about it, you're experiencing fear or absolute terror, you're unable to access those higher levels of cognitive functioning. So again, depending on what brain state you're in, determines your cognitive abilities. Just kind of crazy to say, right? You would think, well, I have this brain, I should be able to access all of it all the time. But if you're not in that calm and alert state, you cannot access all the capabilities you have in your brain at that time. So if you're calm and alert, you can access, again, the cortex, that abstract creative thinking. As you go down, if you're triggered or you're in fear or terror, your thinking is going to become more concrete, and then more emotional, reactive, and then reflexive is at the bottom. And reflexive is, of course, you don't even have really a decision to make. It's just reflexively being made for you by your brain. So you lose that ability to think. Brain states also regulate our use and sense of time. So when you're calm, you can think into the future. You can consider what I'm doing after this training, what I'm doing this weekend, when I'm going on vacation next summer, what my future career plans are, like what the trajectory of my life is that I want to be. But as you go through these brain states, if you're alarmed by something, fearful, or you're in terror, your sense of time is connected to those states. So when you're in terror, you actually have a complete lost sense of time, and you don't know where you are. You might be 5 years in the past, or you're experiencing something or something like that. There's no way for you to, for your brain to communicate to you what, like, chronologically, what state of time that you are in. As a parent, I'm just going to make a confession right now. I'm going to share with you something I've said to my kids many, many times when they were probably in alarm or fear, or even terror. Something like, if you don't stop yelling, you're going to lose electronics for the rest of the day. And to a child who's in terror or fear and has lost their sense of time, you know, do you guys think that that's going to be a successful, like, threat for that child? The answer is no, because they can't even think about the future. They're in that moment. They're reflexively reacting to whatever, you know, escalated situation is going on. So
They probably don't even care at that point.
Oh, no. And I don't think they have the ability to. I don't think they have the ability to access, to think through, wow, in the future, if I don't change my behavior now, I'm going to have a consequence. Like the ability to think through that is just, it's not even, they can't access it. They cannot access that part of their thinking brain. Yeah.
And
Right.
Stacy's saying they don't really think at that time.
Mhm.
And she's absolutely correct, because they've done studies and show that your thinking brain completely is not lit up at all. And the other thing is they can't hear you either.
Sure. Yeah, the audio processing versus the visual processing and other things like that. Absolutely. Your brain state also monitors your heart rate. So when you're resting, you're calm, your heart rate should be at your resting heart rate. As you start to get fearful or something's happening that's making you alarmed, your heart rate's actually going to go up. And again, that corresponds to these states that your brain can be in. And last but not least, but kind of in summary, your brain state dictates your functional IQ. So for example, let's say someone is like a high school student, they're an amazing like math student, they know calculus and all this stuff, but if they go in to take a test and they start having real anxiety and fear about, I'm going to fail this, I'm not going to graduate, I don't know what I'm going to do when I go home, what my mom's going to say, if they start going into that fear and terror about this test, or something triggers them in that environment, they smell something that reminds them of a trauma that they experienced, their functional IQ decreases with their corresponding brain state. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where if you're not staying in that calm and alert state, you are actually losing your ability to do your calculus, and you might fail because you're not able to use that, again, calm thinking part of your brain at that time. So I want to try to give you an example of how this all works. And I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you are on a hike in this beautiful section of Pennsylvania with your best friend. You've taken a day off work and you're just like out in nature, relaxing and not staring at a screen and enjoying the leaves changing colors. And it's like a beautiful, peaceful environment. And you're walking along with your friend and you round a bend, and up ahead on the path, you see this. So I'm going to narrate and maybe we can talk through as a group what might have just happened to you in your brain. So in about a 12th of a second, your brain, when you saw this photo, may have reacted to a perceived threat. And your brain is trying to sort out, what is that? Is that a stick? Is that a snake? Like, what is up there on the path? Your heart rate might have gone up or is going up as you stare at this picture. You might have felt like a moment of panic, kind of lost your ability to like think or process, frozen. If someone asked you right now what your plans are for vacation or next summer or something like that, if you were in this position seeing this on the path, there's no way you'd be able to access or answer that information. You are in that moment, like fully assessing that potential threat. So for people with PTSD, like these triggers, which we'll talk about, and these symptoms and reactions are split-second associations. It is your brain doing what your brain does, again, in less than a 12th of a second, making that association. And that association is whatever happened before that had a really scary and bad outcome is what's going to happen now. And that association for your brain actually makes a lot of sense, even if you are at a different place and in a different time. I hope that kind of makes sense to everyone, and I hope I didn't trigger anybody in putting that picture of a snake on there. So I want to give one example from my family, and actually doesn't have to do with my kids, but it has to do with another family member of mine. But I want to bring this up because my family member is actually an adult and is just learning as an adult that she probably has PTSD. And I think for us as caregivers, as Jean mentioned at the beginning about secondary or vicarious trauma, things like that, it's important for us to think about this information through the lens of our children, but also through the lens of ourselves as we reflect on our own experiences. So my family member grew up in a home situation where her mom was great and amazing, but her dad was verbally, sometimes physically abusive, not towards her, just towards her mom. And so at any given moment, he could explode or start yelling or slam doors or punch holes in walls or just get really verbal and rude and aggressive with his language. And my family members told me that when she was a child, what she would do would be to like turn on her inner attorney, and in her mind she was saying all the things that she wanted to say about her dad and defend her mom and why this wasn't right and why this shouldn't be happening. But as a child, she was trapped in this like chronic experience where it wasn't safe for her to do that, and she never spoke up and said, hey, like this isn't right. And nor should she have. She was the child. She deserved to have safety in that moment, and she didn't have it. So what's happening now is my family member is a parent now, and she has 3 kids of her own. And this is somebody who, if you met her, you would know, like, she's never said a harsh word in her life. She's not an angry person. She's very loving, supportive, and everything like that. But when her kids do something wrong, she has had this huge anger response towards her kids. And she said to me that she almost feels like she's tantruming just like they are. Like if they like stomp away and stomp up the stairs, whatever, she's stomping right back after them, you know, and going at them. And it's so disconcerting for her because that is so far like away from her personality. So the reality is that her kids are triggering her with this chaos, this anger, this frustration in the home. And now she's in a position where she wants to have, and she can have control over that situation. And when she was a child, she couldn't have that control. She experienced that like chronic lack of safety in her home of origin, and she could never say or do anything about it. So now that she's in this role as a parent, you know, and at home stressful interactions showing up, and her inner attorney is like speaking out, and she is like yelling at her kids and kind of experiencing and channeling out that anger. So I said to her, I was like, I think you have PTSD. I think that the situation with your kids is triggering you and triggering this past like kind of unhealed infected wound that you experienced a chronic trauma, and you weren't able to escape from it. Now that you're a parent and your kids are that same age, you're re-experiencing that trauma for yourself and kind of trying to come out and control it in a certain way. So I know that in general, as parents, when our kids get to certain ages, if we did experience trauma at that age, that can be traumatic for us. But I wanted to just, again, share that example as we look at the brain states. So even to send an adult who is very typically regulated and calm and supportive to be triggered by a certain event and just go down to that brainstem where you're just being reflexive and your brain's going to a place that this has happened before. You're losing your sense of time. You're not remembering that you're somewhere else with your kids in your home is something that kind of anyone can, I don't want to say be susceptible to, but like experience, I guess. Okay. I don't know if that's relatable for anybody here. Not that you necessarily have PTSD, but that you've had a trigger in your life or something that's gone on, even especially with your kids, where it's bringing out stuff and you don't know where it's coming from, and you're kind of trying to work through that. Okay. So let's talk about evocative cues, or a lot of people say triggers. So that's any sensory input, could be a sight, smell, sound, taste, or touch that activates a traumatic memory. And I'll actually just say it can be anything that activates a memory, because evocative cues and triggers can be really positive too. We probably all have triggers and cues like that can be positive. Like, for example, you smell your mom's making your grandmother's cookie recipe, and your grandmother has passed, and you smell those cookies and you're remembered of how much you love your grandmother. You go to the cabin every summer, and when you get there, you smell like the scent of the pine trees, and you're reminded of like amazing memories you had through your childhood or through your youth. 2 of my kids were adopted from Berks County, and if you've ever been to Reading, up on top of the hill, there's a pagoda. So that's actually like a cue and trigger for both of my kids there. Every time they see a pagoda anywhere, we could be driving in like North Carolina, but they're like, it's a pagoda, we're in Reading. It's any sort of association that you have. Again, sight, a smell, a taste, or a touch from someone that activates a memory. So for people with PTSD, those are the things that send them back into that terror state, that brain state where they've lost their sense of time and their heart is pumping and they are just reflexive and doing whatever they can to protect themselves and keep themselves safe, because that's what the brain is designed to do. Oh, come on. Okay. And so, okay, so we've talked about trauma a lot. I do want to talk about the stress part of PTSD kind of briefly before we go into looking at symptoms of this disorder. So first of all, I want to say that stress itself is not necessarily bad. Like if you have a toddler and they're like exploring the world around them, and if they fall and get hurt and they run back to you and you comfort them, that's actually a really positive, predictable, moderate form of stress where you can explore the world and have the supports that you need when things don't go right, to help you. So the stress in PTSD is often unpredictable. It's severe. It creates vulnerability, especially if you don't have that caregiver again available to you, to support you and provide the emotional comfort or co-regulation to help you manage that stress. So a lot of the things we talk about with our, with you guys, with families, is about reasonable and prudent parenting and enrolling children in activities that are typical for their age group, like soccer or ballet or taekwondo. And our kids might struggle in those environments, but it's actually important for them to develop that healthy sense of stress where I can feel inadequate and still go out and play on the team, where I'm not sure what to do here, but I'm still going to go out and try. And if I fail, I have someone that I can come back to help support me. So stress in PTSD is typically dysfunctional, again, in that it's unpredictable or severe or results in vulnerability, but stress itself is not necessarily bad. And when you have that adult with you, of course, that adult can help you regulate yourself and get back to that calm brain state with the support you need, instead of leaving you down there in that terror or, fear category. Okay, so let's talk about some of the symptoms of PTSD. So there's 5 different clusters or like groupings that I put together here, or that are commonly known to be part of PTSD. And the first one is really common, that people are, I feel like, more aware of, and that's intrusion. So you have intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, distressing dreams, or flashbacks. For people who haven't ever experienced a flashback, I know that we have all had dreams. So I want you to think back for just a minute to a dream you had recently, if you can think of one. I had a dream within the last couple of days that my husband was like a serial killer, and I didn't know that, and he was like hiding bodies around the house. Anyhow, when you're in that dream moment, it feels so real to you, right? Like you really think that you're living in that world of that dream. So think about that when you think about people. If you know someone who has PTSD and they're experiencing flashbacks or something, it's just like your dream. Like those people believe what they lost their sense of time, again, that they are in that place or in that time, and it's very real to them. And it is real because that's their perception. So just want to kind of validate that, that experience. Avoidance is another kind of symptom cluster. Avoiding people, places, activities, objects, and situations related to the trauma. Avoiding talking about things that may trigger distressing memories, or just avoiding that area of trauma. So it's important to think about avoidance, especially for therapeutic resources, because there might be challenges for folks with PTSD with opening up or talking in therapy, because they are not ready or able to look at that event or events or problem kind of head on. They feel safest when they avoid it, or they avoid going out in public or doing anything related to whatever caused that trauma. Alterations in mood and cognition. So this is really interesting and complex and really pervasive across a lot of disorders. So an inability to remember important aspects of the traumatic event, having negative thoughts and feelings, that lead to distorted beliefs about oneself or others, like I am bad or no one can be trusted. So I'm curious to know if anyone was on Rachel's session 2 weeks ago about attachment. Does anybody or can anybody identify a connection between this symptom cluster and some of the material that Rachel presented about attachment?
I definitely see the connection with the avoidance and the mood. Because if they're taking out and they're still dealing with the trauma of being at home, then you had the PTSD on top of it. They would avoid contact with the parental figure in order to feel safe. You know what I'm saying? And I think as far as the moods, it would explain the big swings that they have, especially in the beginning of when they're placed into our homes. I feel like all the children tend to swing a lot in the first couple of months that I've ever had. Anyway, they just can't keep, and that even includes special needs children. They can't keep they can't regulate their emotions.
Mhm.
And that would kind of fill in with some of the PTSD stuff.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other feedback or insight about the attachment connection there?
Holly says the avoidance is a big one. And I'm just going to blurt out that if you were separated from your first family, you're going to think it's your fault and therefore I'm bad. And so that's how it's connected because, well, in my mind, the attachment issue. Yep.
Yeah, and those distorted beliefs about your own self or about others, about why you're in the situation, who's to blame, things like that can definitely be connected. Thanks, guys. So alterations to mood and cognition as well, ongoing fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame, less interest in activities previously enjoyed, feeling detached or estranged from others, being unable to experience typical emotions are also symptoms of PTSD. And last but not least is alteration in arousal or reactivity. So being irritable, having angry outbursts, behaving recklessly or in a self-destructive way, being overly watchful of one's surroundings in a suspecting way, being easily startled or having problems concentrating or sleeping. So I think it's really important to think about that reactivity and reflexive behavior. So one of the behaviors that you all as foster families in general are pretty nervous or avoidant of is any child who's been described as having any sort of aggressive behavior where they've hurt someone else or had angry outbursts, behaved recklessly, things like that. And I want to bring that up in the context of PTSD because I think PTSD is often the underlying cause of some of that behavior. And as we talked about with like the picture of the snake on the path or looking at the brain states, when a child goes to that terror, they're triggered, they're afraid. It's not like they're being aggressive. It's that they've lost their ability to think and they're just being reflexive. So I think it's important to maybe look at that behavior in a new light. And that they're having reflexive reactive thinking as opposed to really trying to harm another child or your dog or you. It's really reflexive for them at that point. Okay, so with all of these symptoms, has anyone else ever heard of any other mental health or other disorders that might have symptoms that we see here on the screen? I know you guys have got some.
Nate Rossi says anxiety.
Yes, 100% anxiety. What else do you guys have? What about much less interest in activities previously enjoyed? What's that a hallmark of? Anybody?
Depression, ADHD, bipolar.
Thank you. Yes, 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 yes. What about ODD, oppositional defiant disorder? being irritable, having angry outbursts, behaving recklessly, or self-destructive.
I,
Yeah.
I deal with medical kids, you know that. And I think that a lot of these things happen with medical kids, especially when they're in the hospital a long time and I don't know if they have an actual diagnosis for it, but I think a lot of medical kids that are often in and out of the hospital have that same problem because they're afraid of, her put back into the hospital and getting involved with things and then losing everything again and going back into the hospital. So when you're dealing with any kind of kid with long-term illnesses or long-term issues, I think the fear and the mood changes are often there because they can't have a quote unquote normal life.
Mhm.
So I think that can show a lot of this that you're telling us about. Just not being able to want to do the activities because they don't want to be part of something and then pulled out again or get sick again and lose everything over and over again. I don't know if there's an actual diagnosis for it, but I notice it a lot in medical kids as a nurse,
Mhm.
that the kids go through these like huge mood swings, even as they're being patient in the hospital.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
don't know if there's an actual diagnosis for it, but you see it a lot in long-term kids, like kids that have long-term
I mean, isn't it medical trauma, then medical PTSD? Basically, it's PTSD based on medical trauma
Mhm.
in my mind.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for sharing that, Jean. Anyone else have anything that they see on the screen here that there's a connection really with some other diagnoses that they've seen in the past that maybe we've overlooked that it might be PTSD? If not, that's okay. So, and up top here I have the symptoms. These will all vary in severity because again, trauma is experienced on a continuum. So you might have someone that has a little bit of all of this. You might have someone that's really heavy in one of these symptoms clusters, or someone who it's almost hard to figure out if this is what's going on with them. So, and that's all PTSD. It's not, we're not ranking people's trauma based on, the severity of their symptoms. All those things are very real. So I'm not sure if I'm really allowed to use the term intersectionality for something like this, but I just did anyway. So here are some of the symptoms, just, in a more like visual sense for visual learners. We got avoidance on here, being frightened, having a negative mood, negative thinking, being on guard, avoiding places, having the flashbacks, trouble concentrating, being aggressive, loss of interest, feeling guilt and shame, using substances, trouble sleeping. By the way, for your prospective foster parents on this call, you should all expect trouble sleeping from, whatever disorder happens to be, and bad dreams. So here's a graphic that I really like of just one common diagnosis. So, I mean, I can't tell you if I had to pick a number of like the amount of kids in our care who are diagnosed with ADHD, either like that's really the thing or it's not the thing, but I want to say like at least 75%, maybe even higher, of our kids in care have a diagnosis of ADHD. And sometimes it is ADHD and sometimes it isn't, it's something else. So I think as you look at this, and I know that there's other circles we could have intersections here on autism and attachment issues, like it's so interconnected. But I want you to look at this and think about it, and maybe think about, as you care for a child, those ADHD type behaviors, which are more well known, look at them maybe through a different lens, and that lens being the lens of PTSD. And I'll share a very small personal story connected with this. When my oldest son, who is about to turn 17 in February, everyone say a prayer for me, first came to live with me, he was on a enormous dose of ADHD medication, enormous. And they were recommending from his previous foster home that be increased. And he would actually sometimes like wander around our living room, just like wandering around in a circle. And like, it was really sad. But what I've kind of observed is that a lot of times we use ADHD and ADHD medication to kind of mitigate some of the presenting behaviors that are associated with trauma or PTSD and in the child welfare system. So take that as what you will. Sometimes I think that's positive. That child needs that support, and needs to help focus and needs that decreased impulsivity or support with that. But other times I think we're just medicating the wrong thing. So that's kind of your role as the parent to look at the child in front of you and kind of try to figure out with their team, with their clinical team, what really might be going on here and what supports they need. So let's move into talking about some interventions for this diagnosis and these symptoms. So the first intervention, which we'll always say, I'm sure, is therapy. And there's different types of therapy that can address PTSD. One is EMDR, which you may have heard about. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So EDMR was developed by a psychologist in the late 1980s. And she noticed that when she moved her eyes back and forth really quickly as she moved throughout the park, a lot of her stress responses, those again, the heart rate, all those like brain state stress responses that we talked about, were decreasing for her. So EDMR is a therapy that's conducted by a licensed mental health provider who has taken specific training, and it combines elements of a range of other therapeutic approaches with eye movements or other formal forms of rhythmic stimulation, such as hand taps or sound. Theories as to why EDMR is effective are still evolving, but some people think it's because with the eye movements, it might help the brain access and process traumatic material, especially because like your eye, oh my gosh, my brain is now foggy. Your nerves and optic nerves that connect between your eyes and your brain. So sometimes, basically the idea by doing the rapid eye movement, that you can access memories or things in the brain that might be otherwise inaccessible to you or kind of challenging to access. Something else, another like form of therapy for you to just be aware of if you have a child you think has PTSD or has PTSD, would be trauma-focused CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. Trauma is experienced by the body, and it's a very sensory experience. So cognitive approaches like talk therapy and talking with people through their trauma and their PTSD only works when the person has the ability to kind of use their thinking brain to access their lower levels of the brain. So I share that to say that for some people, talk therapy might not be effective, or it might not be a method that they can really benefit from if they don't have those executive functioning skills or the ability to access that calm thinking brain. So play therapy is really supportive for children, but also sometimes for older youth if they're a younger developmental level, to kind of explore some of those memories and things through play. Okay, so before we go into the next little section here, I just want to give you a 3-minute brain break. Get up, walk around, go to the bathroom, do jumping jacks, refill your water bottle or something, and we'll come back in 2 or 3 minutes, 6:55, and dive into this next section, so I can have you guys all tracking with me if that's okay. Okay. So in terms of interventions, other than having your child or yourself participate in therapy, there's another kind of model or strategy I want to present to you. And this is all from Dr. Bruce Perry's work through the newer sequential model, which provides a framework for how to communicate to a PTSD impacted brain. So the 3 R's, which we'll talk about, are regulate, relate, and then reason. I was going to show you a video that I guess it is still called a video, right? If it's on YouTube, a video of Dr. Perry kind of explaining the neurosequential model. But I think in the interest of time here, I'm going to explain it to you briefly and then direct it for you to watch on your own with the resources. But the neurosequential model basically communicates that when you communicate to another person, you're not communicating to them calm state to calm state or cortex to cortex, the most thinking part of your brain. Your communication to them actually travels sequentially through the most primitive parts of their brain up to the most cognitive or functional levels. So like if you're a teacher and you're in math class and you're talking to kids about how to do division or whatever, they're not just connecting with you cortex to cortex or calm to calm. They're processing all that information through the brainstem and through the other more primitive parts of the brain. So as a result, at any point in that kind of sequential processing, that child can become triggered or have a somatic trigger or sensory trigger that impacts their ability to understand what you're communicating to them. So again, I didn't think we'd be as I thought we'd be farther along than we are. So I'm not going to actually show you the video today because it's 18 minutes long, but I'll direct you to it in the resources, and we can still talk about what the strategy is utilizing the 3 R's. So basically, the idea behind the neurosequential model is then that if a child is in that terror or fear state of the brain, first you have to regulate, help them co-regulate. Then you have to relate to them. And then finally, you can reason with them. So doing these things in sequential order is again connected to this neurosequential model when we're acknowledging what these brain states are, how they're impacting the person across the table from us, and responding accordingly. So when a child is experiencing a PTSD symptom, a trauma trigger, or a dysregulation from a lack of felt safety, can we brainstorm together what each of these 3 things might look like? So, and then we'll put some scenarios together. So for you parents, foster parents, or birth parents on the call, when a child, they're in fear, they're not thinking, what are some ways that you can help regulate your child in that moment?
Potentially remove them from the situation and get them to a calmer state in a different environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Holly said breathing.
Mm-hmm, sure. Like deep breathing, like modeling deep breathing. Yeah. What are some things that you guys do to regulate your own self when you feel dysregulated?
Music always helps with my kids too.
Mm-hmm.
They have their own little song that kind of brings them mind out of where they're at. You know, especially if we're doing something in-house, again, hospital type stuff. That's I usually get them not to think of what we're doing. So music always helps in my world.
Mm-hmm.
And in the chat, Nate says cold therapy, which I'm not sure what that is, but sounds really cool. Stacy says drawing and writing things down, and Holly says removing ourselves from the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all of those things, I bring that up to say that all those things can be effective for a child in an age appropriate way. Regulating a child might look like physically comforting them, rocking with them, just modeling those deep breaths, like someone said earlier. Great. What about relating? How do you relate to a child when they're starting to regulate? How do you relate to them and kind of connect with them and show them that you understand what they're feeling? What does that look like, or what might that look like?
I think important would be get on their level and get eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
Just to piggyback on what Jean said, it is a very important thing to kind of get on their level
Mm-hmm.
and just to kind of understand where they're coming from. You know, if they're on the floor, if you can get on the floor with them
Mm-hmm.
and just, you know, kind of meet them with eye contact and just show them that, you know, you are definitely in tune to what they're going through.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. What else might it look like to help a child to relate to a child?
You can join them in imaginative talk. I know in my personal situation, I talk for my dog. Sometimes when my son is coming out of being super upset, and so we join like that in this imagination world, and it really takes a lot of the stress away. And by the way, Jean also said a weighted blanket is great
Mm,
for regulating,
for
which
regulating. Yeah. 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 Thanks for sharing that, Kim. And I think like the official term for what you're doing is narrating. Which we do a lot for like little tiny kids, right? We're like, oh, you're crying, oh, you're so sad, it's okay, I've got you. But older kids need that too, especially if again they're struggling to regulate their emotions, or they're not as emotionally mature as maybe their peers are, or as their chronological age, to narrate and say like, oh wow, that really scary sound came by with the ambulance, that was so scary, are you okay? Or just validating, yes, it's really hard when your friend said something mean to you at school, and just like relating to them and getting on their level, getting into their world, all the things you said, you guys are exactly right. And reasoning, I think that reasoning is the one that none of us really have trouble knowing what to do with. I think the problem is that we just go to reason way quicker than we we should. We kind of circumvent the regulate. We don't look at the brain state first. We just go right to trying to reason with the child. And that's where, at least for me as a parent, I get super um, messed up sometimes. And with this kind of strategy or approach to helping someone who's experiencing PTSD symptoms, it's also important to note that you have to be in that reasoning brain state yourself before you can help someone else regulate or relate to them. So, like with all the strategies you guys mentioned for your own self-care and stress management, if you're not in a place where you can do that on your own, you actually need to take your step away, take a walk, listen to your music, do your thing, to get to a point where you're accessing your calm brain state before you can share that with somebody else. So that's also something I know for me as a parent, if I'm being honest, a lot of times I overlook or regret later that I approached a situation when I myself was not in the right brain state.
I
So
know sometimes when I'm at home, my daughter, she starts acting up and stuff. And to help my wife and stuff, if they're the two that are clashing heads, sometimes like I'll pull my daughter to the side and start talking about like music or stuff that she's into, like Legos and stuff, until she gets calmed down. And then we try to go and talk about the situation and stuff then.
yeah. So yeah, you're adding another R in there too, which is redirection. Can I distract you by talking to you about music that you like, or Legos? That's a good one. And relating to her, which is awesome. So yeah, that's great to kind of circle back then when everyone's able to have that conversation with a sense of calm. Um, so okay, we kind of went all through this. So regulation is the ability for you to manage your own emotions and behavior. And when your child is dysregulated, even over something that's seemingly small, helping to get them back to a point of being able to express their thoughts and emotions safely is about what regulation's all about. So when your child is dysregulated, again, they don't hate you, they're not a horrible child, but they're in that fear brain, which is that fight, flight, or freeze response. Blood is moving away from their frontal lobe, from their cortex to the amygdala, and reason and relating are impossible for that fear brain. So regulation, like we just talked about, is step number one in the 3 R's. Practicing your own deep breathing, thinking about what it looks like and the ways that you've seen your child re-regulate themselves is important to kind of look for those patterns. Once the child is breathing more typically, their heartbeat's kind of relaxing, you can see their body language, you know that you can move on to relating to them. And again, you guys already presented some really great strategies or ideas for doing that, helping that child feel heard, feel seen. Another way to think about this is the word attunement, or being just aware and responsive to that other person's emotions. So this is where we show our children empathy and compassion, and like Crystal said, kind of get into their world. Children who have experienced abuse and neglect were often alone in their distress. So this is where that attachment again comes into play, where you're showing them that you won't leave them, that you're there from them, that you want to talk through the situation, or even if they're not ready to talk, just be a physical presence there with them. And those connections are what help provide that ability to really bond and work through a lot of these challenging things together. And then reasoning is where we tell them what they did wrong. No, just kidding. This is where you're connecting with your child's higher level brain to talk about what occurred and reflect on what you might be able to do differently in the future. This could look like role playing, reading a book together that teaches the skill that they need to work on, or just having a conversation about what, to do differently next time. And again, that involves some reflection. So what I want you to do, you can do it by yourself, or if you're at home with your partner, you can do it together. Just pick one of these scenarios and spend like 3 to 5 minutes discussing with your partner how you would handle this and how you would kind of implement the 3 R's, what that would look like in each of these situations. Goodness. And then I want to come back and I want everyone to share kind of what they came up with. So it's 7:09 right now. So what about at 7:13? We'll come back. I'll give you 4 minutes to talk. Again, you can just pick one, or you can pick two if you want. And I want everyone to share with the group so we can all kind of learn from each other about what approach you might take in the situation. Does that make sense to everybody? Think about how to implement that 3 R approach to a child in this situation. I'm going to stop sharing that for just a minute so I can see all your beautiful faces when we talk about this. Who would like to go first? Jean?
Me and John picked the what about the grocery store?
Okay.
For one thing, I think the first thing is to make sure the child is safe. So if they're at that sort of a panic stage, the best thing would be to try to scoop them up. Obviously, if they're a teenager, the best thing would do is try to pin them into a smaller space, so that whatever is triggering them, they're at least in a safe space. Because obviously, they're not thinking about the traffic. They're not thinking about anything that can happen that can endanger them. So our primary thing would be to get them to a safe situation and just sit with them until they can regulate, wherever that is, whether it's on the sidewalk, in a corner, whatever you can do it. The second thing we would do is once they get to the space is to try to get them to the car and get them into a situation where they can feel safe again. And don't move the car, just sit in the car with them until you can talk about it and say, like, try to figure out what triggered it. At that point, you can talk to them and say if they want to try it again. If they don't want to try it again, then you go home without avocados. Oh, well, this is just life. Okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. You might not have the right supper, but it doesn't matter. And then once you get them home where they're really feeling safe and they're in their rooms and, they kind of forgot about it, go back and try to talk to them again and work on that. You know what I'm saying? Work on it at home. A way to get them back to the car is say, like, hey, we can go home, or we can get some ice cream instead. Try to, just get them out of that space of whatever triggered at that grocery store, whether it was the doors, the sound, or even the store itself. You don't know where they've been or how they've been there. So something might have bad happened, like if their parents took them there and, they could have had a meltdown or something bad happened at that store. You don't know. So the biggest thing is safety first. That's always our rule. And then just generally try to get them out of the situation. That's how we would do it.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else? Stacy and Cliff, which one did you guys do?
I'm sorry. We missed it. I was getting Elle out of bed.
Oh, that's okay. No problem.
What is the question?
No, it's no problem. It was just like a scenario to talk through and think about what you might do or like how you might handle the situation and use the neurosequential model, but that's not a problem at all.
I apologize.
It's okay.
Now that the one over here is quiet, I can talk. No. Hush, please. We picked the event with the sugary sweets and everything. They can't see you, stop. We've been through that situation. We would remove the child away from the area so they couldn't see it. And try and get them to calm down. And once they're calm, talk it out, right? Yeah. Talk it out and, explain to them, they've already had a lot of sugar. We tend to, this one has had like 2 cupcakes and some other things going on today because Dad decided to bake and he wants more. So we talked it out. We're like, later, another day, stuff like that. But basically remove them from the situation because if they're, especially if it's right in front of them, they're going to keep going on and on and on. And going to Nate said, move them to a can you please take this away? Nate said to move them to a non-stimulating area. And hopefully it'll calm them down enough to start, relating and reasoning and move on from that situation.
How can you, like, what statements can you make, or how can you, like, relate to your child in that situation?
Um, I mean, any number of things, like from, even saying that, we want it too, but we've had all this sugar and it's not good for us. Or, Grayson, you have to move away because that is loud in the phone. Or something along the lines.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
I've had the same experience in the grocery store with my kiddos. And or I'm sorry, no, I'm not doing the grocery store. I'm doing the event. And that's where they had the sugary drinks. So we've gone to Hershey Park many of times. And I'm pretty sure everyone can relate to that, taking a bunch of kids with you. But in my situation, it was always my son. Whenever he would get hungry, I knew, to make sure, I had his snacks on hand or whatever. But, in this case, we were at Hershey Park and, he had tons of snacks already and things like that. So what I had done, like, we talked about it and, I said, hey, you had this already. It's probably not good for you to, to have X amount of sugar, right now. But when we get home, how about I fix you a different type of snack before bed, and you can have like fruit or your whatever choice of fruit, that you like. Whereas I was kind of, still kind of solving the sugary craving, and then also too, getting in the nutrition, that he needed. And, I would allow him to pick, which fruit he wanted. So that was his bedtime snack. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes he tantrumed. And, I would let him tantrum, if that's what he needed to do to help regulate himself, that's what he needed to do. But I didn't pay attention to the tantrum. I stood there to make sure he was safe. But, if he still didn't accept my no, we just waited him out. Until it was over. Eventually it ended. I mean, it might have taken 5 to 10 minutes, but we allowed him to go through it because he needed to do that. So that's my experience in working through that. So, we reasoned with him. I related to him, because I wanted a sugary, dessert as well. But I knew, I had to model, for them what I wanted to see happen. So, we just, said, okay, we've had enough. And like I said, it just really depended on his mood and if he was able to accept that. Of course, the older that he became, he understood it more. But as a young child, it was really hard for him to understand why he couldn't have it now. So, yeah. So, we've been through it. We've worked through it. And, he understood the expectation the next time we went. So we would explain it before we went in, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to handle the snacks. And, it kind of worked in that way.
Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Kind of what Crystal was kind of saying, since we did miss it, like kind of saying what she's saying too a little bit. When we take like our daughter to Hershey Park and stuff, like she'll be like, well, I want cotton candy, I want funnel cake, I want ice cream. And I mean, and normally we give her like one option if she behaves. I mean, we give her, if she starts like getting anxious and stuff, staying in line, which she does, which Crystal knows all about her, and we give her like one opportunity where we'll pull her to the side, make her sit on the bench and wait. And then she has the option, we can keep going, or she's going home. And then what we kind of decide then at the end, I mean, but she can only have one based on her behavior then the rest of the time.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's important to remember, like with that one about the food, is that, you know, sure, kids, want sugary stuff because they're just kids. But also, if we look at this through a potential like PTSD lens, if the child is feeling like because they can't have that food item that they're really truly feeling like unsafe, or that, this is a reminder to them of food insecurity, or the fact that they need to kind of fight in life to get what they want, kind of look at it through a little bit of a different lens. So thank you guys. Thank you all for sharing that. So the last, I'm going to share my PowerPoint for just another second here. Really the last thing I wanted to say to all of you is to not give up or feel like the situation is hopeless. If someone does have is diagnosed with, or you think that they are diagnosed with PTSD, the quote I put on here is that neuroscience have discovered that consistent, safe, loving relationships are essential to promoting healing and recovery from the devastation of unresolved trauma. So when you as a caregiver are consistent and show that individual that in the middle of their flashback, their mood issues, their aggressive behavior, anything that any situation that they're experiencing where their brain is telling them that they're unsafe, or they're losing the ability to access their thinking brain, that you're there, that you're with them, that you're willing to kind of be with them in that moment and model for them what regulation looks like, relate to them, and express that you understand the problem that they're going through, and talk it through with them and get them access to resources. Love is therapy. And I once heard the example of this coat hanger used to think about how trauma impacts people. So if you think about these old like metal coat hangers that I have pictured here, I'm sure we've all seen ones that either came apart or were like twisted up and things like that. So life experiences for a lot of our kids, that's kind of what trauma does to them. It impacts their shape and their functioning. But kids and people also have plasticity and resilience, and with healing and being willing to understand how the brain works and help support a child over time in rewiring their brain, hope is possible. So if this hanger is your child's brain and it's distorted by trauma, it's never going to come back and look exactly the same way that it looked like before the trauma happened. But you can still use it to hang your favorite sweater, and it can become really functional in life. So trauma impacts us, but it's also not a deal breaker, or there's a lot of things that with the right support that for our kids that we can work on to help them have that functioning and support in life that they need. So I am going to email you, anyone who's on here, a list of resources, and I will include that video that I didn't get to on the from Bruce Perry, who I'm a big fan of, talking through the neurosequential model. One of my other resources is one of his other books. So thank you all for participating tonight. I hope that you gained insight into PTSD and kind of have that lens and framework that you can put in place when looking to support your own kiddos. So I'm gonna stop recording.